Well, good morning. I was up here last fall, and I got to tell you a little bit about why I think missions are important. But first, let's have an opening prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day that we can come together and be sheltered from the snow and the cold, and we can be here together worshiping you. We await your soon coming and look forward to it. Be with us this morning here together. In your name, amen. Well, I told you a little bit about why I thought missions were important, which was a subject I had spent some time thinking about because we were preparing to go to Nicaragua. And that was a challenge in several ways. One was that it was expensive, but also, having done it before, I knew it would be a lot of work. And after it, I can say it was even more work than I thought it would be because it was very hot in Nicaragua. It was in the 90s, which seems quite nice now, but when you're laying block and moving it around, it doesn't seem quite as nice. But to start with a little geography lesson, Nicaragua is located in Central America. It is about the size of New York State. It has coasts on both the Pacific and the Caribbean side. It is the poorest country in Central America, poorer than both Honduras and Costa Rica, which border it. But they don't really let that deter them. They have a very distinctive lake. If you ever find it on a map, it might be because it has Lake Nicaragua, which is the largest lake in Central America, and the second largest in Latin America, which would include South America as well. It's a very large lake, and being on the Pacific, it is part of the Ring of Fire, and Nicaragua is very geologically active. There are a lot of volcanoes, and there are a lot of earthquakes. And so we didn't really have to worry or think this time too much about all the reinforcement we put into the church. We knew why it was there. Some other places we've wondered a little bit, but Nicaragua, earthquakes are common enough that we knew it would serve a good purpose. Nicaragua, as poor as it is, has experienced a growth in tourism over the last several years. People like sledding down the volcanoes or sandboarding, like snowboarding. And there's also a lot of reason to go to Nicaragua for the environment, the wildlife that's there. We got to see some of it when we were there. It's a very jungly country, and yes, that picture in the middle is a squirrel. It's a white squirrel with a black stripe down its back. When the guide told us about it and we hadn't seen it, we thought he was maybe confusing it with a skunk, but no, it turns out to be a squirrel. Well, when we went to the city of Huigalpa. When we returned the rental van, the rental woman asked where we'd gone, and when we told her Huigalpa, she looked very confused and said, no one goes to Huigalpa, because that's not where the tourism is. The tourism is up near the capital of Managua, and Huigalpa is much more of an agricultural, industrial city. It's the 10th largest city in Nicaragua. It's about 70,000 people, and we got to build a church right about there, fairly close to the center of town. A few blocks away is the big market, where all the trading and the clothes and all sorts of local goods are sold. And you can actually see it on this map. There's an empty lot right there on the corner. What you can't tell from this picture is that the street leading up to that corner is a very big hill, and that church has quite a bit of prominence there on the corner. Well, before we got down there to build, there was a lot that was going on that we were not necessarily a part of. But Maranatha was working with the local church and with our trip coordinators to arrange for all the building that needed to take place. And I'll invite my father up here to talk a bit more about that since he was involved with it. And you'll get to see a little bit more about what goes on with the Maranatha project, where there's preparation happening, but it's going on with the local church.
Good morning. Somehow this mic is in a different place for Eric. First of all, Do you believe that God answers prayer? I do too, and I thank you for your support of our mission trip. And what we share today, I hope, will inspire you that not only does God answer prayer for us, but He does it for our church in many, many ways that we will never see or understand. You remember when we had General Conference session last, they publish information in our church papers about our church corporately. Anybody have an idea about how big our church is? We're about 17 million people today, give or take. Do you know what our balance sheet says our assets are as a General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists? About 23 billion in assets. We're in 202 countries. And it's easy to take that big, high view, but what we talked about for sharing with you this mission trip today was taking you all the way to the other end, to an individual experience, a long-term study in faith. And so hopefully we'll be able to shift your perspective today to see how God answers prayer from one lady, one family's viewpoint there in Huigalpa, Nicaragua. Eric told you about the experience of nobody goes to Huigalpa, so you can imagine when Americans show up there, they're noticed. What do they know about Americans? What they might see on TV in the news, or perhaps worse yet, DVDs. And you can imagine they might be kind of reserved about that. But there's a lady who is the origin of Seventh-day Adventism in Huigalpa. Her name is Yolanda. She's here in this picture. She's 66 years old. She has been spreading Seventh-day Adventism in Huigalpa for 40 years. 5 years ago, they began building their first real church building in Huigalpa. So 35 years of ministering to that town before seeing a church be built. It wasn't just her, though. She's married, and her husband is pictured here. His name is Roger. We'd say Roger. And that's a granddaughter there by the name of Yahida. She's ministered to her family. And they've ministered to their family. There are nieces and nephews, and it grows and it grows. And so there is one church today that has a building in Huigalpa. There's another family looking to have a church, and it's all because of Yolanda's ministry. Well, when we arrived in August, this church family knew that Maranatha was going to help them, but honestly, they didn't know how, I don't believe. And we tried to show them. Imagine now what it's like for this family. The average income for about half the population in Nicaragua is about $7 a day. They had secured a piece of land for their church, and they had raised $1,200 to put toward putting up a one-day church structure. And that's what they'd been told they were going to get. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with a one-day church structure or not, but it's really just what we call light gauge steel. It looks like metal studs that are heavy duty enough to hold up a roof, and it stands on columns, and it's a roof structure, and the local church is expected to put the walls around it. That's what they'd been told they were going to receive when we arrived in August. We shared with them that we had come to build them a complete church building, a sanctuary, with an open classroom behind, not unlike what you saw in the children's story. Now, they're very reserved because, of course, we're scary Americans, but I think they were also confused, as I came to understand later, because while we were telling them things they really wanted to hear, they, I don't think, were ready to believe. They were expecting a one-day church, and we were talking about building a whole building. So as we presented that to them, this is the building that we presented in. This is the church that they began building 5 years ago and have built as they could assemble funds. This is the inside of that church. Dirt floor. There's the little concrete slab that Judy made reference to in the children's story where the children sit. This is the baptistry, and they do baptize people in there. They fill it with water and bucket it out when they're done. but they baptize people there. And it is a living congregation. I worshiped with them that day, and one of the amazing things about being part of God's World Church, I'm just fascinated. I've been to 6 different countries, and I'm amazed how uniformly the worship service is in our church, no matter where you go. Well, they have stepped out in faith. They have their site, and they began to clear it themselves. This is the location. Again, they think they're getting a one-day church. They're hearing something different, and I'm sure she's not quite sure what to believe. But they start to clear by hand this site. And this is Yolanda at the site. And this is when materials start showing up. Now, your faith is beginning to be rewarded, right? You're 40 years into your ministry of this city, and you're seeing your prayers being answered. That's a lot of material for a one-day church, isn't it? Well, you're excited, but you're also a little scared, I expect. Yolanda and Roher live a very simple life. Roher actually was staying at the site to guard these materials, sleeping in a hammock under a shelter. Yolanda shared her bathroom with our group. It's a pit toilet. So you can imagine that while she's excited, she's also kind of scared about what this American group really means. Then we come to the site. You can see the Maranatha has come early, and they have poured that slab back there in the background. And there's all these extra materials, and you can imagine that she's maybe a little afraid to hope, but hope is growing. And then all these people show up. And yeah, that's me there in the middle trying to help our group understand what we're going to do, not even really thinking about how much less the church members really understand. But we go to work, and they start to see things happen. And by the way, they're reserved, but they're not lazy. And they see not only are we putting in structure, but they're starting to pour footings, because one of the side stories that I'm sure no one explained to them at all is that while we raised funds to be able to help them build all of this material here locally, we were blessed to have achieved our highest possible goal, and Maranatha, 1 week before this trip, agreed to help us get the materials to be able to put walls around the classroom as well as around the sanctuary. So now we're pouring footings right here on the site to extend the building over what had been committed to them that they didn't really, I don't think, be prepared to believe. And you see the work going on. They start to see things stand up. And here are church members joining in. This is a block passing line right here. And lest you think that, well, there's Roher, he's getting involved. He's 66 years old as well. And I will just tell you that at one point our pastor, Pastor Ringstaff, was in the back of a truck shoveling sand out, and he came out of that truck, probably 110 degrees in there, saying that that was really hard work, and what really made him realize it is, he just said, that little old man put me to shame. Well, look at this. Yolanda can't stand by and watch. She has to help. And we go to work. And they rapidly see a difference. Remember, the last church took 5 years. We're suggesting we're going to do this in 2 weeks. Do you imagine that this is hard for them to process? But then they start to see results. Anytime that you want to wonder if your work is valued, all you had to do is look at Roher's face. He was all grins all week and talking nonstop. So there is our structure, and what I'd like to do here is, you'll see pictures. There are stories to tell, more than we could take time today to tell, but I want to make sure you get some of the personal stories of our experience there. I know you know how a church gets built. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking construction, but you'll see construction as we tell the human stories, as we try to help you see what it's like for this little church group.
The gentleman in red is Miguel. Now, if any of you have ever taken a trip anywhere and you've gone by bus, you get acquainted with the bus driver. And at least if you're my father-in-law, you get acquainted with the bus driver. Well, and everybody in our group got very well acquainted with Miguel. In fact, he's sitting right next to Rachel Love's younger sister who went with us. And so the two of them were a little bit taken back because here's a bunch of Seventh-day Adventists who don't do everything the way you think things should be done. And Miguel ate with us, but he was unaccustomed to not having meat in his diet, as well as Shannon being very unaccustomed to no meat in her diet. But they joined in, and there's a little bit of a friendship developing. And Miguel had to drive us wherever we went. And so he learned that you drive him to this site, and he took various routes to the church. There were times when the van would leave after the bus and arrive 10 minutes ahead of the bus, and the people on the bus had no idea where they had gone. Well, he was learning, what streets to go up and he could go down, and even though he had lived there, it was hard to get a bus around some of those places. And he also then, this is at the beginning, it was Thursday and Friday, attends church with us. But then on Sunday begins a whole new experience for Miguel. Miguel goes to VBS, Vacation Bible School. And at that time, they find out, those who are involved in Vacation Bible School, which is over at the established church on that dirt floor, and some of the team goes over there to help while everybody else is building, and Miguel is going back and forth and helping wherever he can. Well, they discover that Miguel is an artist, and Miguel actually makes signage for them because in the afternoon, the church no longer is a VBS program. The church turns into a dental office where a couple of dentists have come with very limited equipment, very limited in water supplies or electrical supplies. What they can do is clean teeth and pull teeth. And that's what they do for the next 3 days, while Miguel is there trying to help as best he can and asking, can he bring his children to VBS? And he did all the crafts with the VBS people and got even more acquainted with the children. And he was a little confused for a while, though, because people kept showing up with his son's name on their shirts. Because a number of our team had attended Andrews University, and they would wear their Andrews shirts. And at the last day, we got to meet little baby Andrew, who he felt kind of belonged with us since we all wore his name. Well, at Vacation Bible School, they had even asked our daughter-in-law, Shaston. She had given them an idea of several health talks. She could spare one morning from the site, and she would come give them a health talk. But she wanted to know what the children's Sabbath school leaders felt was the biggest need to tell about the children. And what she came up with was they felt that their children needed to learn more about how important proper sleep is. Of all the topics on diet and exercise and pure water and those may have been it, and rest, they felt the greatest need for the children was proper rest. And so Miguel got in on all of that too. Well, you met our family that we got so well acquainted with at the site, but David didn't show you one family member. He hung out at the site all the time. He usually could find shade. The last day there, he found the rock pile, climbed to the top of it, and said he was king of the hill. But there were always dogs in the church. And we thought they were stray dogs, except that the family would play with them and treated them as pets. So we think they were more than just that. David spoke to you of Roher's shelter. This was Roher's bedroom for part of the time we were there. Can you imagine that you leave your comfortable home down the hill, comfortable arriving at the site and saying, where are the restrooms for our team? And Yolanda going, oh, we could use these restrooms down at our house. And to get to them, you go down the street, turn left, down a steep staircase, which actually goes between the two rooms of the house, which aren't open. You're in a corridor between the rooms, over a rock wall, around the bend, to a two-seater outhouse, which is well ventilated because there are spacing between the slats. So you always would take a guard with you to make sure nobody... Anyway, that was Yolanda's. And we went there because they told us there was another restroom we could use down the hill a little farther, but they were wanting to share the nice one with us. So Roger left all of that, and he came to this dwelling where he put his hammock up, because now, not only was he going to work during the day with these crazy Americans, but he was guarding all the stuff at night. He was there through the night. And that was he was going to make sure none of the things disappeared that were needed for the building of his church. And, about the second night in, we met him the next morning, and he's going, and then Spanish. It was so cold last night. He had just been really cold on guard duty in his hammock. And when our team found out about that, they looked a little bit confused because none of us had turned off the air conditioning to feel how cold it was that night. We had run our air conditioners all night just trying to get down to maybe 80 degrees. But unfortunately for Roher, he didn't get to keep this nice place to use as a guard station because it was discovered that that property did not belong to the church, which they knew. They thought that they could borrow it for the week. But the former Adventist who they'd made arrangements with, their brothers changed their minds, and suddenly all the supplies that had to be up on the hill had to be off of it. So the building site becomes very, very tight because they only have this corner lot. They no longer have this little half lot beside it that they can use for all the supplies. So we arrived one morning, and they've been moving things since daylight down. And that's a lot of things to move. In fact, they had to move all of the roofing supplies down into what's going to be the new classroom. And in the process, Roher is injured. He has made a nice slice open on his arm. And we're richly blessed because we had a nurse practitioner with us who, when she sees this kind of thing, it's, all right, now something I know how to do. We had prayed for no injuries, but we also were very glad to have her with us. And she just looked at it and said, and started taking care of everything there. And she gets Roher all bandaged up, and she says, you need to go home for 2 days and rest this arm. It is a bad enough injury. And Roher, very sad, looks at her and then makes his way down the street to his home. And as we're building that morning, it is barely 2 hours before Roher is back on the site, wheeling a wheelbarrow, grinning and talking perpetually, and telling us he is just fine. He has things to do. And he never missed any time after that, despite the injury. We also had another little delay. Now, we were in a little bit of a panic, some of us, because we're going to build a whole building, whole church. But we're also going to do 3/5 of another church to make into this extra classroom. And that's a lot of block to lay by people who don't lay block. A lot of learning. And one of the things was we have a lot of young women in the group. In fact, one man didn't want to come with us because he was afraid he was going to have to do everything because all these young girls were coming along. And we had just said, you have no idea what they can do. We've seen, Rachel Love was one, we have seen what she can do. You can come sit in the chair and give directions if you want, because we've got a team who can do this. That was before we added on the 3/5 of an extra project. And so we were going to working long hours, and then this fellow shows up and starts talking to the pastor. And you can see he has a television camera in his hand, and he is from the local TV station, because word has gotten out that there are strange people in the city, and they want to come and find out about the strangers, which they do, and they insist on a TV interview. Well, David doesn't want to give up work time. He needs to get some blocks set so that we can start laying the next course, and he gets drug off to do a TV interview, which we finally said, you're going to have to do that if we're ever going to get this building done. And then we go on with life and find out on Sabbath that because of that television interview, there is a professional young man in attendance at church. He is there because he saw the TV interview. He had been raised a Seventh-day Adventist. He was actually a master guide in Pathfinders, and he had no longer attended church because his schooling required him to go on Sabbath. And here he finds out that he has a new church so close by and decides he's going to reconnect with his Seventh-day Adventist roots because of that annoying interview. When we were there, we had an opportunity to climb the side of a mountain, and we were at a spectacular view. You can see there are hills all around. And we had said, we've got to bring our church group up here. And so that first Sabbath, we asked the church members, would you meet us on the top of the mountain at this park? Because we wanted to get to know them a little better. I know we were very scary to them, but we thought, if we can spend brother-sister time and fellowship on Sabbath, we're going to be less maybe intimidating. And you just don't have Eric stand by them, and they're a little less scary. But as you can see up on this mountain, we could look out over the city. The cathedral stands out very strong. But we had a panoramic view, and as we brought the church members up, they had that same view. And you can see them just kind of standing back and looking at the Americans, and the Americans were kind of standing back and saying, I wish I could speak their language so I could talk with them a little better. And so the two groups were up there, and we decided we could all interact and meet each other. And they introduced themselves, and we sang, and they would sing a song in Spanish, and we'd sing a song in English, and you could see some grins starting to come on the faces. We took pictures of all their family groups and found out who they were, and then we had worship together. And we were in for another surprise, because as they listened to worship and looked at us, they discovered that there was a story in the Bible they didn't know anything about. And Shaston's there trying to translate the story, but there were words like cupbearer and Babylon, and that doesn't fit in with her medical construction translation skills. But the pastor, who you see standing there, caught on right away to what story was being told. And he jumped in to translate to his church, and he was shocked also that they did not know the story of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, who had gone to the king and asked, can I go and rebuild the walls of the city? And was allowed to do that. And by family groups, they rebuilt the city walls, sword in one hand, whatever tools in the other, as a protection. And in 52 days, they had the city walls rebuilt enough to be saved. And how families had come to Nicaragua to work with other families to not build the walls to keep people out, but to build the walls that would bring people in. And that was the first Sabbath as sunset in Nicaragua, as the two church groups began to interact and become one family up on that mountaintop. A new experience at the end of the week after celebrating the first Sabbath in the new church and fellowshipping again at sunset up on the mountain. Instead of being them and us, people had become one and were interacting and hugging, and suddenly the fact that we didn't speak the same language didn't matter so much, because now we shared something, and that was the fellowship of being together on the Sabbath day. I think Eric has a little bit more to share with you.
Well, as you can tell, there's a lot that you missed out on if you didn't go. But there's a little bit more to the story, and it goes back to where we started with the story of Roher and Yolanda not really understanding what they were getting. Mom showed you a picture of the red roof panels that Roher cut his arm on. We don't usually use red roof panels, but that was what they were able to get for this church. And as they were putting those on the roof, we could tell that Roher was starting to understand what was happening toward the end of the trip. And as that roof went on, a look of amazement was just on his face, and he kept saying to himself, "Tremendous." He really didn't realize what that church involved until it was almost done. Up until then, all the provisions that God had made for that church family were almost confusing. They didn't really understand how it fit in, what their role was. They saw prayers being answered, but it looked like it might involve a lot more from them than they originally anticipated. But once the sign went on, and you could step back and see that church on the corner, they actually took an axe to a couple of trees that were in front so that church would be more visible. They were so proud of it. And then on Sabbath, we introduced them to haystacks, and there were 125 people there. And a whole church gathering, seating outside, people crowded all around, people, I don't even know if all of them were from that church. And you can see the look on Yehida's face about how pleased they are to have that church that's drawing people in. And sometimes we ask, why don't we just send the money and have locals do the work? But when these strange Americans come to town, it's a lot like the circus showing up. People come out to see what's going on. And I can't help but think about Roher and Yolanda's experience with their answer to prayer and how that relates to us in a lot of ways, in that sometimes we pray, and the way God seems to be answering that prayer is almost a little bit confusing. We don't understand all the steps that God is going through because there are things happening elsewhere that we are not party to, and no one has explained to us. But we keep working on faith, and there's a part that we need to play, but the work is being done by others, by God, and when it's all over, I think we too will be sitting there saying, "Tremendous." Thank you.